no reason to believe or disbelieve it. As they say, no, don't believe it, don't disbelieve it. Of course, you get samples of the hell here itself.
So that's what I mean. Is it a metaphor or is it?
It's the reality. I mean that way.
And similarly, the whole issue around Dave, whatever,
Yeah. This, as I mentioned in one of the earlier interactions, there seems to be some element of meditate, you get certain experiences which are not belonging to this realm, then you begin to wonder कि कहाँ से आ गया है.
Okay.
You were present on this matter.
Yeah, so sir, I was reading this book, Jahan Jahan Charan Pade, Gautam Buddha. It's a Hindi translation of his
Old Path, White Cloud.
Old Path, White Cloud.
Beautiful book.
Yeah, yeah. So I was near the end, and in this chapter 65, so there were a lot of things which were not easy to grasp, or some examples probably which we had seen before. So my intention was that maybe some of those things we can discuss here, and then I eventually made it into a presentation, and so hopefully I'll try to put my understanding through the presentation, and then we can have discussion around that. If you want to refer to that, I have already sent
Last night.
last night.
Because I saw it at 10 p.m. also, there was nothing.
Yeah, really, just I think just after 10 p.m. I had sent. So I have sent both PDF and PPT. You can actually open PDF if you can look for easier.
I actually remember that, I read it.
Okay. Okay. So the title of the chapter in the book is Neither Full Nor Empty, and so I will also try to add a title from my side, which is Full and Empty. So either you say full and empty, or you say neither full nor empty. And to start with, there are these two questions from my side: what is full, and what is empty?
She has answered.
Yeah.
Full is something, full of something.
Yeah. So So whatever my understanding is, so I have put that also in presentation.
No, then don't ask the question, answer it.
Yeah. So that's yeah. So the chapter says that full and empty have no meaning of their own. So full is always full of something, and empty is always empty of something. So there is no independent existence of full and empty.
So emptiness means empty of something or empty of everything?
So let's take an example. So if we had a bowl with some water in it, and then we throw the water out from the bowl, so we can say that bowl is empty of water. So empty of something.
But it is full of air.
Or
But it is full of air still.
yeah, but it's still full of air. So the question which you later ask, empty of everything. So this is a question which comes up later also, that is there something which can be empty of everything? And the next thing which comes out is that emptiness can't exist independently, and that is again the same way to tell that empty always means empty of something. You can't have some absolute emptiness because you need to say that something needs to, this thing is empty of something. So there is no independent existence for emptiness. So we can actually take an example from the book. I'll try to directly read the example from the book. So there is this conversation happening where bhikkhus are sitting, and Buddha is giving some deshana, and Ananda asks some question, and then Buddha replies. So Buddha says, Ananda, we are all sitting together in the Dhamma hall. There are no markets, buffaloes or village inside this Dhamma hall. There are only bhikkhus sitting and listening to the Dhamma. We can say that the hall is empty of all that is not here, and it contains what is actually here. The Dhamma hall is empty of market, buffaloes and villages, but contains bhikkhus. Do you agree that this is correct? And Ananda replies, yes, Lord. Then the Buddha continues, after the Dhamma talk, we will leave the Dhamma hall and there will no longer be any bhikkhus here. At that moment, the Dhamma hall will be empty of markets, buffaloes, villages and bhikkhus. Do you agree to that so? Ananda replies, yes, Lord. At that moment, the Dhamma hall will be empty of all those things. So then the Buddha says, Ananda, full always means full of something and empty always means empty of something. The word full and empty have no meaning of their own. And Ananda says, please Lord, can you explain that more? And then the Buddha says, consider this. Empty is always empty of something, such as empty of market, buffaloes, villages and bhikkhus. We cannot say that emptiness is something which exists independently. Fullness is same. Full is always full of something, such as full of market, buffaloes, villages or bhikkhus. Fullness is not something which exists independently. At the present moment, we can say that Dhamma hall is empty of market, buffaloes and of villages. As of all Dhammas, if we say that Dhammas are full, what are they full of? If we say that all Dhammas are empty, what are they empty of? So that is the example given by. There is a conversation between Buddha and Ananda. So the next question which comes out is the emptiness of Dhamma. What does the emptiness of Dhamma refers to? So the answer which comes out is that Dhamma is empty of any permanent and changing self. So that is a statement which we can explore more. But before trying to explore this statement, we will try to get answer to what is Dhamma. So the definition of Dhamma is everything contained in 18 realms. And what is the various 18 realms? There are 6 sense organs, 6 sense objects, and 6 sense consciousness. So, example of sense organs are eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, etc. And similarly, 6 sense objects are form, sound, smell, taste, and 6 sense consciousnesses are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. So these together, 6 at each, form the 18 dreams, which together form the Dhamma. So that is the basic definition of Dhamma given in this chapter at least. Now we come to the question of emptiness of Dhamma. So the answer is that all the 18 realms which form Dhamma are subject to birth and death, and to change and dissolution. None of the 6 sense organs or the sense objects or the sense consciousness, they possess any separate or individual self. So we'll explore this question more in detail. So we say Dhamma is empty of permanent self, but what is the still meaning of permanent self, or does a Dhamma exist? So there is slight confusion which comes out here, is that we say that Dhamma is empty of any permanent self, but we say that Dhamma is empty of permanent self. The question which really comes out is that if it is really empty, does Dhamma actually exist? And there is nothing permanent in it which keeps changing. So that is the question which comes out. But if we use our example of earlier, that empty or fullness is something which is with regard to something, they don't have any independent existence. So for Dhamma to be empty, it must exist. That is one simple answer which we can say.
So just one point. I'm still trying to understand the implication of this. So one way to look at this is there is the container and the contained. There has to be a container, otherwise what is it which is full or empty? So if you are saying Dhamma is either empty or full, then Dhamma has to exist. There has to be a container. But this notion of that it can only be empty of something and cannot be empty of everything, that part I am still struggling with. So you can say when everything else is removed, there will be air. But theoretically you can even create a vacuum in there and pump the air out. So what is the message? I mean, so the container has to be there for it to be either empty or full, but beyond that I am not sure I am understanding the message.
Yeah, so the message, so we are only looking at only the one aspect, right? The emptiness aspect. So the second aspect which will come later is the aspect of fullness. So that will possibly give the complete picture. So so I'll stop here and again read from the book the example the conversation happening between the Buddha and Ananda. So Ananda says all Dhamma are without. This we understand, but then Lord, do the Dhamma actually exist? The Buddha quietly looked down at the small table before him, which was placed a bowl of water. He pointed to the bowl and asked, Ananda, would you say this bowl is full or empty? Lord, the bowl is full of water. Ananda, take this bowl outside and empty all the water out of it. Venerable Ananda did as the Buddha instructed. When he returned, he placed the empty bowl back on the table. The Buddha lifted the bowl and turned it upside down, and he asked Ananda, is the bowl now empty or full? Lord, it is no longer full, it is empty. Ananda, are you sure the bowl is empty? Yes, Lord, I am sure the bowl is empty. Ananda, this bowl is no longer full of water, but it is full of air. You have forgotten already. Empty means empty of something, and full means full of something. In this case, bowl is empty of water but full of air. So this is a question. This is the example we have already said, but I've just mentioned it to put it in the context. And with this context, we can say that Dhamma exists because for Dhamma to be empty, there first needs to be exist. That is the initial message which comes out. So we can try to look from different aspects. So this is a question which was added from my side. This is a question which didn't directly existed in the chapter. Is Dhamma full? So if we have to go to the fullness aspect of Dhamma. So here is this. We've read this.
Actually, I'll add another thought to what you said, which is if the assumption is that the container can only be emptied of something, but not everything, then the container is always full. You empty it with one thing, but there is something else which will fill it.
Yeah. But the answers given here.
I'm sure those are different. I'm just saying.
Yeah. So actually, they go to the next level. They don't play at this simple definition of fullness. The definition of fullness which comes out is much more difficult to understand. And so in fullness of Dhamma, the way the fullness of Dhamma is defined is that we have this law of dependent co-arising, which we call the principle of interpenetration or interbeing. And we say that all Dhamma exists in this interpenetration or interbeing. Now to explain this thing further, we say that Dhamma, for one Dhamma to exist, it needs to exist dependent upon all other Dhammas. The presence of one relies the presence of other. There is another example which is given in this book. Within this, that is, within that, this is. So earlier we said that there is no permanent self. The message is coming out here is that there is no independent existence of a Dhamma. There is this dependence on other Dhamma. For one Dhamma to exist, all other Dhammas need to exist. And we can actually see via example that what does it mean. An example clarifies it much more nicely. And I'll try to read out this example again. So again this conversation is happening, and so Buddha says, Ananda, we have spoken out about the empty and a full bowl. We've also spoken about an empty and full Dhamma hall. I have briefly spoken about emptiness. Let me speak more about fullness. Although we have agreed that the bowl on the table is empty of water, if we look deeply, we will see that this is not entirely true. The Buddha lifted the bowl and then looked at Ananda. Ananda, among the interwoven elements that have given rise to this bowl, do you see water? So that is a question which Buddha is asking, and Ananda replies, yes Lord. Without water, the potter would not have been able to mix the clay he used to fashion the bowl. So Buddha says, just so Ananda, looking deeply, we can see the presence of water in the bowl, even though earlier we stated that it is empty of water. The presence of bowl depends on the presence of water. Ananda, can you see fire element in the bowl? Yes, Lord, fire was necessary to complete the bowl. Looking deeply, I can see the presence of heat and fire in the bowl. What else do you see? Buddha says, I see the air. Without air, the fire could not have been burned and the potter could not have lived. I see the potter and his skillful hands. I see his consciousness. I see the kiln and the wood stacked in the kiln. I see the trees the wood came from. I see the rain, sun, earth which enable the tree to grow. Lord, I see thousands of interpenetrating elements which give rise to this bowl. Buddha replies, excellent Ananda, contemplating the bowl, it is possible to see the interdependent elements which give rise to the bowl. Ananda, these elements are present within and without the bowl. Your own awareness is one of the elements. If you look away heat and if you took away the heat and returned it to the sun, if you return the clay to the earth and the water to the river, if you return the potter to his parents and the wood to the forest, could the bowl still exist? Ananda says, Lord, the bowl could no longer exist. If you return the interdependent elements which gave rise to the bowl to their sources, the bowl could no longer be present. So, this kind of example we actually never discussed before, and possibly this kind of example may not exist in principles, may directly come from Maya.
It is a part of Maya. This conversation is not a part of it.
Yeah, but at least so this actually when you read it first time, that you're trying to say that for the existence of bowl, everything else needs to be existing. At least I have not heard of this statement before. But my understanding was that at least by law of dependent origination, this was eventually actually meant that for one thing to exist, other things also need to exist. And what really to make of this example is one thing, but nothing else. This example still explains the law of dependent origination, in the sense that it explains that how probably the various elements of law of dependent origination play together. For one to exist, we have to assume the other to exist. To put it very simply, it says that if birth exists, the death must also exist. For interdependent on one and another. So, now coming back to so the message which came out in the last example was that when we look at this bowl, we see the potter, and we look at the potter, we see the bowl. Interbeing means that is that, and that is this. So this is the example directly given from relation with this example. And so now coming back to our Dhamma, it essentially means that emptiness of Dhamma essentially says that no Dhamma can exist independent from other Dhammas and possess a separate or essential self. So this is the example which comes out, which we have already discussed. But the book goes about and takes this to the further level, and we have already read it many times, and most of the suttas start with have this example that form is not self, and we can say that form cannot exist independently. So it is explained here in this chapter also that what is the meaning of form cannot exist independently. And the message which comes out here is that for form to exist, feeling, perception, mental formations and consciousness needs to exist because of the law of dependent origination, in the sense that for one to exist, others needs to exist also. The existence of feeling is the existence of perception, mental formation, consciousness. So no aggregate have a separate identity. Aggregates are empty in the sense that they don't have a permanent existence, but they are interdependent on other aggregates.
So if I understand correctly, is the basic message that of oneness, which is because you, so, and which we have discussed a lot of times before, which is because you cannot differentiate yourself as a separate entity from the rest of the universe. Therefore, this whole notion of I or self is futile. When you gave that example of there is water in element or fire element even within that bowl, right? So, and something that actually we discussed once, I remember when we were doing that mindful eating. I remember you said something to the effect of when eating, think about what has gone into producing these vegetables, the effort that farmer may have put in, and then someone would have brought it to the market from where it came to our home, someone cooked it. So we are all linked together, and we tend to have these artificial boundaries between what we call as self and others. So, because is that the main message of this?
The message which I am able to understand is slightly different in the sense that with this example of interbeing, it says that for me to exist, for my body or my feelings to exist, I am also dependent upon everything else in this universe. So I am not a separate identity which exists different from you or different from anything else. my existence is dependent upon the existence of everything else, and I am dependent upon everything else. Whatever have preceded me before, I am the consequence of that, and whatever I am doing will be what will happen in the future. That is the message which I get. That I am related with everything else here. And everything else includes at least any non-living thing also. That my identity depends upon the identity of everything else also. And given that we as a human being exchange a lot of matter, we eat food and oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. So logically, it makes sense that what was part of me is now part of something else, and what was part of something else was now part of me. So it can be seen from that angle that I am dependent upon everything else, and everything else is dependent upon me. And to continue, so there is this one more surprise left in this presentation. It tries to explain the concept of birth and death, so which is also very fascinating. So we will move towards the concept of birth and death. So before that, what Buddha actually tries to explain is that there are these two views. The first view is that everything has this separate or permanent self or nature, and so we have already seen that that may not be the case. There is this second view which regards everything as illusion. I have added the word Maya. So what Buddha actually says that these are the two opposite extremes, and if you cling to any of those extremes, if you consider yourself to be a separate or permanent, or you say that everything is illusion, then you can't progress further. You'll get stuck at that. The middle path of Buddha is in between two, between the existence and non-existence. That is the middle path which Buddha is trying to explain here. We now come to this concept of birth and death.
So that's interesting. So you're saying that even the notion that everything is Maya, that's Ati, is it?
That's the, yeah. The example given here is that. So you are actually still seeing it from the angle of whether things exist or things doesn't exist. The concept of emptiness is that nothing is permanent, but nothing is independent of everything. So it's a very tricky concept. It says that it is full and empty both, or it's neither full nor empty. So this is the message which comes out in the middle, and this is what shunyata or emptiness, English translation, essentially tries to say. This is what I can understand.
Yeah, also no, just quick clarification. So when you use Dhamma, you are referring to its interpretation as mind state. जब यहाँ जो इस्तेमाल हो रहा है धर्म शब्द का उसका क्या?
I was also initially confused with the word, and actually book refers to the word dharma. So I had to look, and eventually there dharma is a Sanskrit word and dharma is a Pali word. And probably my sense is that you should keep dhamma as the 18 realms, the various consciousnesses, its internal and external states, and the result of those consciousnesses. So, or you can say these 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formation. That is dhamma. That is the example which comes out.
Actually, this notion of Maya, illusion, there is definitely some element of illusion in Buddha's teaching, in the sense that this whole, one of the main messages is that what we consider as self is actually not us. Okay, it is our illusion that this is we. We are. There is a sort of nearly automatic programming that's driving this body and these thoughts. And by mindfully watching, you can for a moment realize that yes, this is not us. This is something else. So to some extent, this notion of illusion is built into Buddha's message, that you are under this illusion that you have a self when you don't have a self. So I don't know, maybe there is there is a further extreme which says everything is illusion, and maybe Buddha's message is not about that. But there is clearly some element of there being illusion. There is no self is like saying you are under an illusion that there is self.
But the moment you have this law of dependent origination, you actually try to remove that illusion. It actually explains this illusion. That's the message I took. It says that you exist, but you exist as those 5 aggregates. But those 5 aggregates they don't have a separate identity, in the sense that your aggregates are different than anything else. They are just the aggregates. And these aggregates may be giving the consciousness, but beyond that, they are just aggregates. You are the result of those aggregates, and eventually those aggregates will keep on forming something else.
This is where I think I have a little bit challenge understanding. I'm not so sure the message is you are these aggregates. I think the message might be that this is not illusion, this is something, just that you are not this. So I think what the message might be is that when someone says some Maya hai, then you maybe even define physical things. Physical things are not Maya, they exist. But the illusion is in the fact that you tend to identify yourself with this. That
is fine.
Yeah.
There is a separate point here which says that when you say you are not this, you are still giving a self. So the question of self is not about whether I have self or not. It's also about, does this mic have a self? Is there a separate identity of anything, not only me? And so by saying that everything is a consequence of something else, the logic that you put to yourself saying I don't exist also applies to what you replace yourself with by saying I don't exist, these things exist. But do they exist? They also don't exist in that sense. But doesn't mean nothing exists. It means it's so deeply interdependent because of the law of causality, the way it is explained, that it's sort of a flux. It's a very difficult thing to explain in words, but it keeps moving, and things keep happening, and that's what there is. So
in some sense, Buddha is saying that you are just one part of that flux, and try to see it from that angle. So actually, the last part is about birth and death, and that actually tries to explain more of it. And there is an example here which I'll take, which really tries to make this thing. And so again, there is this opposite statements. But now we are trying to introduce the conceptual level and the absolute level, and we are saying that at conceptual level we can speak of dhammas being born and passing away, but from the point of absolute, all dhammas by nature are birthless and deathless. So what this statement really mean, we can understand by an example. The example is of a Bodhi tree. So I'll directly read the example. Ananda, take this example of the Bodhi tree you planted in front of the Dhamma hall. When was it born? Lord, it was born 4 years ago at the very moment the seed put forth roots. Ananda, before that, did this Bodhi tree exist? No, Lord, before that there was no Bodhi tree. Do you mean to say that the Bodhi tree arose from nothing? Can any Dhamma come into being from nothing? Venerable Ananda fell silent. The Buddha continued, Ananda, there is no Dhamma, that is all the universe, which can come into being from nothing. Without the seed, there could be no Bodhi tree. The Bodhi tree owes its existence to the seed. The tree is the continuation of the seed. Before the seed penetrated the roots into the earth, the Bodhi tree was already present in the seed. If the Dhamma is already present, how can it be born? The Bodhi tree's nature is without birth. The Buddha asked Ananda, after the seed penetrated roots into the earth, did the seed die? Yes, Lord, the seed died in order to give birth to the Bodhi tree. Ananda, the Buddha replies, Ananda, the seed did not die. To die means to pass from existence to non-existence. Is there any Dhamma in all the universe which can pass from existence to non-existence? A leaf or a mote of dust, a trail of incense smoke, none of these can pass from existence to non-existence. All these Dhammas transform into different Dhammas. That is all. The Bodhi seed is the same. The seed did not die, it transformed into a tree. The seed and the tree are both birthless and deathless. Ananda, the seed and the tree, you and me, the bhikkhus, the Dhamma, all that leaf, a dust mote, a trail of smoke, all are without birth and death. So this is the example which is given for birth and death. So if we apply to our life, we say that because of those 5 aggregates, we are formed, and when those 5 aggregates transform into something else, we call it death. So, but in reality, there is no birth, there is no death. It's just that 5 aggregates came and then they went away. So this explains this interdependence, and this is what it says, that there is no permanent self. And says,
so when Buddha says that so there is no more birth for me to become. And the Arhants explain what is it?
So it's like when the bowl disintegrates, or even when the bowl was a bowl, the bowl doesn't know it's a bowl.
Yeah.
But I think I
They knew it. So they knew for sure that I not go there. I mean,
right. Yeah, so which means that it's just like Buddha is just like the bull. The bull doesn't
what
know.
about me?
नहीं सर, मेरे हिसाब से
Some difference or not?
इसका मतलब ये है कि when you see so when you, there is a birth, you say
He's
that
saying there is no birth or
yeah.
I'm just asking.
Yeah.
How do we understand that?
So
We can discuss it later.
yeah.
Let me see what you.
Yeah. So what actually Buddha means is that because we see birth, we see death. But when you really see this interplay of everything, you can actually come out of that illusion and really see that there is no birth, there is no death.
Then there is this issue of coming out of the illusion. Somebody is coming out of the illusion.
Coming out of illusion or just seeing this interplay. If we don't use the word illusion, we can say that once you see this law, once you understand this law of dependent origination, that you are connected with everything else. This five aggregates form and this aggregates.
Question is why do it form? Is it something forming now, or is it they are all existent, as you was mentioning, like a plenum?
They exist.
And they combine randomly to form one star, form randomly to form Hilda, randomly to form Deepak.
Not randomly.
Possibly it's the law of karma where one thing is leading to another.
Who's coming?
Eh?
Who's coming?
Who is?
Who's coming?
See, the moment you ask who's karma, the karma will start to dissolve. If you don't ask that, then there is karma. Right?
So let us complete it then.
Yeah. So I'm already complete, and there
You
is
are already complete. You are full. I say 13th.
13th is his last slide. He says that the true nature is neither full nor empty, no birth or no death, or becoming or dissolving. And there is last example which tries to explain that. And I'll read this example. Ananda, have you ever stood on the seashore and watched the waves rise and fall on the surface of the sea? Birthless and deathless are like this water. Birth and death are like the waves. Ananda, there are long waves and there are short waves, high waves and low waves. Waves rise and fall, but the water remains. Without water, there could be no waves. The waves return to water. Waves are water and water is waves. Though the waves may rise and pass away, if they understand that they themselves are water, they will transcend this notion of birth and death. They will not worry, fear, or suffer because of the birth and death. That is correct, but which is very difficult to again grasp. That being a wave, don't think yourself different from water.
So this is like even Buddha's direct sentences from Tripitaka have this Amritattva even in the beginning and all that. But by talking, he will steer away from saying such things. This is dangerously close to Advaita. Yeah. So
What is your आप लोग बताइए आपका क्या ओपिनियन है इसके बारे में?
I'm still trying to understand. I haven't really got it.
Yes, I've come here.
yeah, I am not surprised at all because I thought these are the variations in how people interpret. So, the question हुआ क्या है?
अगर पूरा सुना नहीं ये जैसे एग्जांपल दे रहे हैं ये जो स्टैंडर्ड अद्वैत एग्जाम्पल है कि समुद्र है, समुद्र में लहरें उठ रही हैं, लहरें भी समुद्र है, पानी है, बेसिकली तो वही डिफरेंट फॉर्म्स लेता है. So this is the classical example used in Advaita. Adi Shankaracharya used very powerfully. Different forms होती हैं, different beings are like different waves which arise in the ocean of being. So there is a being, there is a cosmos, there is a super soul, or there is a God, whatever you want to call it, and things are manifestations of that God, or manifestations of that universal consciousness.
That doesn't seem to say it.
Yeah, but intention is how it always.
Yes.
These things, if there are forms which arise from water,
Right.
but water is always there.
Right. But
So
then
the feeling is that there is something called
there is
water.
that
which
is
is
the analogy, right? Because when he tries to say that dhammas are empty, so the moment you say there is no permanent self even of the dhammas, then you go away from there being a water, because you say where is the water coming from? Then it's also dependent. So the moment you say there is interdependence at all levels, there is no firm ground to stand on. Because that middle path that he mentions between saying everything that doesn't exist to saying everything as a permanent self seems to be slightly away from saying that analogy, of course, is not right.
In fact, that analogy has done a lot of confusion because it sounds very powerful. Analogy sounds very powerful. I remember when we studied the Upanishads and teachings of Adi Shankaracharya. So this captivates your attention. It sounds so powerful. This is what it is. So if you have a theistic mind and you believe in one God or whatever, then this sounds absolutely plausible that this is what is happening. So that is manifesting in trees and plants and animals and everything. Existence is basically the existence created by God. Good. So I think we need to see through the presentation and this chapter very, very subtly. It has sharp similarities with the teachings of the Buddha and subtle dissimilarities, as I know it, as I would say, as is given in Tipitaka, as is the tradition of the Theravada. I think you can say that is obviously one tradition. There is another tradition. This is the tradition of the Mahayana, basically. So, and as I mentioned earlier, also there is great Mahayana scholar, Nagarjuna, with tremendously powerful intellectual abilities. So, in fact, called second only to the Buddha in terms of historical personality. So, he tried to put the exposition, he tried to explain it further. He says he's explaining it further, the teachings of the Buddha, especially on non-self, emptiness concepts, he explained it further. If you study Tipitaka, and there is a discourse where Buddha mentions, Ananda asks him, what do you mean by emptiness? Emptiness, people keep on saying. His cryptic answer is empty of self. Empty of self, empty of ego, which means empty of an abiding, permanent entity. That's it. Nothing more than that. The concept of interdependence, interbeing at the physical level, as we see, as mentioned here very beautifully, is a later addition to it. It doesn't mean it's wrong, it's a later addition to the teachings. Buddha never mentioned it. He has never talked about interdependence in that sense. Dependent origination and interdependence have a very subtle difference. Similarity but difference. So, the modern ecological narrative is based on interdependence, understanding of interdependence. It cannot be denied, obviously. If this will happen. Cause effect relationship is there. But he never used to explain, I have not seen as a theory at any discourse, and I think other commentators have pointed out, there is no discourse where Buddha talks of interdependence and interbeing in the sense in which Mahayana is talking about. system. The two extremes which Buddha talks of are called annihilationism, that is the one, and eternalism. Eternalism meaning that there is an abiding entity which is always present. Annihilationism meaning there is nothing in it, matter ends. The illusion is not Buddha's statement. The extreme of Maya is not a Buddha's statement. This is added by Adi Shankara later. Concept of Mayavad was added by him. So the two extremes with which he strikes the middle path is these two extremes. One, the materialistic position. जो चारवाक position थी, यावत जीवेत सुपर जीवेत, बसमें बुद्धस्य शरीरम पुनर्जन्मना विद्यते. That is one extreme. There is nothing. When you are when you dead, finish, matter ends. There is nothing there. What are you bothered about? The other is, no, there is a soul which will take you round and round and round. So these are the two extremes which Buddha pointed out, and he said in between there are 62 different philosophies. And one of them is this, that there is a universal consciousness and we are all one. Which he said is one of the strongest nets which binds the people to the cycle of the universal. So the Advaitic position of non-duality is also seen by him as one of the bondages, as one of the wrong views. That's a very powerful statement to make. What does he say? There's a discourse, in fact I had thought we'll study that, maybe sometime we'll study it. One of the powerful discourses on non-self, called the snake simile discourse, Aladhya Upama Sutta, which is generally quoted as one of the profound discourses from understanding the non-self. So there is two analogies given there, which seem to be opposite to each other. So what he points out is that I don't see any any notion of self, any philosophy of self, by believing in which you can escape from self. What does it mean? That whether you believe in self is there, or if you believe there is no self, even that will point.
Right. So, in that sense, his objection to Advaita is perfectly valid, absolutely, because it's not about being.
Says it's not this. The issue is that if you think that there is a self of one dimension or another, this kind or that kind or that kind, or that is the description of reality, you'll get caught in it. You'll not get out of suffering. So that's why he scrupulously avoids any mention of self or non-self. What does he say? Every time you will see Panchupadana. What do you think about the discourse? What do you think if there must be in a forest, if somebody breaks these twigs and leaves of the trees, would they be taking and burn it out? Would it be burning you? No, they are not mine. They are of the tree. So similarly, so you should give up whatever is not yours. And what is not yours? 5 aggregates are not yours. Because you don't have any control of them. They don't belong to you. And so the non-self concept which he explains is confined to just this. These 5 aggregates are not you. Or these 6 ayatanas are not you. 6 objects are not you. 6 So this is the strict boundary which he puts. He doesn't say, therefore there is no self. He doesn't say that, never.
I think the one problem that I see that happened later is that while he says there is no permanent self, the only thing he gives permanence to is this state of Buddhahood, which is the.
He doesn't say that.
He doesn't say. But what happened was that the moment you basically say there is this notion of, because all those attributes that Vedantists used to give to Brahma were given to the state of Buddhahood in some sense, in some later on. And so because of that, there is this, that is what made Buddha into a god, right? Because Yeah.
So everywhere there are different opinions on
Yes.
that. There are people who think that Buddha was made into a god in order to bring him down actually. In order that he becomes a part of the Hindu
Not them. God in the
And-
Buddhist tradition.
yeah.
Forget the
No, that is only of this, the concept of Buddha as a deity is a part of admixture of savage man Buddhism. That admixture which took place in Kashmir and Ladakh and other areas. So they mixed up two and made him into a deity and then to pray and do all those things. So if you read the Buddha's, if you read Tipitaka, it's very interesting. You never find any discourse where he says there is no self. What he's saying is the five aggregates are not your self.
Exactly.
Don't get that. So he says precisely what is needed for. That's why he says I teach suffering and way out of suffering. Nothing more. There's a discourse, of course, where he says, you see how many leaves you see in my hand? Just a few. And how do you compare with the leaves in this forest? It's obviously infinite. This what I know is like the leaves of the forest. But what I tell you is only this. Why I tell you only this? Because this is needed for extinction of suffering. That is not needed for extinction. You get lost in that. So once you know the actual experience of extinction of suffering, then whatever you can know, you know. Then knowledge will not be binding. Otherwise, knowledge will become a binding because you can create concepts.
Actually, the problem, as you said rightly, the problem with saying there is some universal self, the same problem exists if you believe that I am not this five things. If you start believing this, if you don't see it, then it doesn't matter. Because the problem is in believing, not in what you believe. Because otherwise, if you want to penetrate, you have to stop believing, which is not easy, right? Because that's Yathabhut darshan.
The issue is that one has to practice.
Right.
What should I practice?
Right.
That is the question.
Right.
So, while it is true that one should not believe in it, but then one has to practice something. Should I practice that there is one consciousness which exists and pervades in this cosmos?
Right.
Or should I practice
I am
that these
not.
five aggregates are not mine? You have to choose between.
Right.
That is the issue. So, this whole issue of non-self is so counterintuitive that it becomes extremely difficult to really understand it, quote unquote, intellectually and comprehend. So it needs repeated reflection to be able to see through it in our day-to-day activities. And how do we see through it? By seeing the suffering caused by believing in self. Because this teaching is primarily from the domain of suffering. So when we see that by believing in self and by taking myself to be there, I suffer. Whether I take my body to be self or my perception to be self, or I take my intellect or take my understanding or take my habit patterns or take the consciousness, I am seeing, I am hearing, I will suffer. So this we can actually experience. All his teaching is fundamentally what you can experience. That is a very powerful thing. He does not teach any concept. These are all concepts. He's not saying concepts are right or wrong. He doesn't get into that. These are concepts. There's a difference between concept and reality. Reality, definition given by the Buddha, is not an absolute reality in the modern scientific sense or in the Advaitic sense. No. Something which you can experience. You experience heaviness, he says that heaviness is Prithvi Dhatu. That's it. You experience heat, that experience is called Agni Dhatu. He's not saying there is a Prithvi Dhatu is something solid or real. He's not saying that. He's not saying that these are the ultimate building blocks of matter. As modern science would say, electron, proton, neutron are building blocks of matter. He's not saying that. He's saying Rupa is that which gets deformed. That is the definition of Rupa. And why it is deformed? Because it is interacting with the world around. The mosquitoes, with the weather, with the food, with this. Constantly getting deformed. And similarly other things. They are all something which falls within our experience. So the definitions are all given on that basis. Because his fundamental concern was freedom from suffering. So it is the various kinds of experiences which we take personally and we suffer. So if you don't take them personally, you will not suffer. That is the basic. The rest of the whole teaching is how do we practice so that we stop taking things personally. So at once, therefore, the teaching is graduated teaching at various levels. You start from dana. Obviously, when you say dana, then you have a self. मैं दान कर रहा हूँ. You are practicing Shila, then I am practicing Shila. I am doing effort and restraint and all that, so that I remains there. So you start from that and gradually move further, and reduce the strangulation of I through practices. Practices of observations, practice of observing whatever is happening, yathabhut, jnana darshan, and slowly you move in the direction where whatever is happening, there is an awareness of whatever is happening. There is no identification with whatever is happening. You are seeing, you are observing. So that is the culmination of the path. But as a teacher, you have to give a path to take people like us, starting from where we are enmeshed in I, to the direction where we can be free from that notion of I. So that is the teaching of the Buddha. Now, in that light, we can see this presentation and this passage which Deepak has read. You should see it in that light. Then it will become in its proper perspective. It's not that it is wrong. It is presenting things from a different perspective, from a conceptual perspective. The idea of oneness is a concept.
So, sir, in our day-to-day, what we then only need to focus is on our suffering,
Arising, yeah.
On investigation that why the suffering is
arising of I. It depends on which level of interaction we want to take it, where we want to satipatthana, where we want to do it. We want to do it at the breath level, we want to do it at the observation level. But that is not mere observation. It is also understanding. Jnanamattai, that is very important. Satimattai, Jnanamattai. So there is Sati and Jnana, both. Sati and Sampajanna, you put it. They have to be together. Because Sati will otherwise become mechanical, just observing, without interpreting, without understanding, without using it to create an insight. It should be used to create an insight into the nature of experience. So periodically we should investigate.
why certain thing is originating.
Yes. All those things are discussed. Satipatthana is a complete, comprehensive statement of that. But still, that is not the only way. Ekayano Maggo does not mean only way. Ekayano Maggo means the direct path. Because Buddha himself gave eightfold path, and Sati is only one element of that path. Dhamma Sati is only one element of that path. So, in his wisdom, he could see that people would need comprehensive understanding. Different people at different stages would need different. Some people are naturally, because of their past, given to living a life of morality. They don't do immoral things. Right from childhood, they live like that. But even if there are children who would not be very much kind of wary of telling a lie, or wary of killing something, or wary of stealing, because they are carrying on with that sankhara. So if we, for example, get into this issue of no birth, no death, and take it literally, then you can get into a statement, a situation, then why am I bothered about all this practice and all that? Aggregates are joining and dying and dissipating. So you have a concept of it. It's not a fact.
And it's very easy to record
you can easily, that is the kind of difficulty with not understanding Advaita and its sense. If Advaita is seen only as an intellectual exercise, then you're lost totally. I've seen so many people. So, क्या साधना करते रहते हो बैठे बैठे क्या करने की जरूरत है सब कुछ सत्य है ना क्या There's no birth, there's no death, there's nothing. The soul it is always moving from here to there. Why are you doing all this? परेशान करते हो और कुछ कहते लोगों को तो ध्यान क्या करने की जरूरत है We are already pure. Soul is already pure. There's nothing to be done. So you can get into that kind of a situation.
तो मैंने ये समझा है कि even if we say that four noble truths are something which give you a statement to really come out of suffering, so even just by saying it or remembering it, and
It has to be understood.
nothing happens.
No, nothing like that. It has to be understood. First noble truth is suffering. There is suffering. It has to be understood. And it has been understood. Understood in its entirety.
But then also he's saying that only way out.
And the understanding is not in cerebral. It is actual understanding. Because Buddha's everything is felt experience.
So
So
only,
when I suffer, actually, then I understand what this is. What is that.
but then the question which I have is that only way out is to penetrate the suffering and come out of it. That is the only way out.
Yeah, but there are so many methods by which you can do so.
Methods can be different, but the way is this.
Obviously, to get out of suffering, you have to penetrate. You can't circumvent it. You can't say suffering is मैं इधर से निकल जाता हूँ इसमें ही रहने दो. You have to go through it.
So then only the real test of somebody is enlightened or not in more worldly sense is to just to see that is he really suffering or not. If
You can't figure out.
we can't figure out. I understand that, but
The person may be ill. He may be having problem. He may be having pain.
yeah, but I understand that for somebody different. But at least for
Right,
personal,
yeah,
yes.
that is the thing. For us to find out whether other
Yeah.
person is enlightened is impossible. I can find out whether कुछ मेरी समझ में आया है कि नहीं when I suffer and see what it does to me. So the way I can find out about my, if I have to use that word, progress, is that I can see what I am suffering about.
There's one more thing is that many times घर में कुछ हुआ है या गाड़ी चला रहे हो जिसने कभी तरीके से ओवरटेक कर लिया, आपको गुस्सा आया, आपने देखा कि देखो मुझे गुस्सा आ रहा है, and then you say ठीक है, this is causing you suffering. So generally I at least stop at that point, so देख लिया कि suffering गुस्सा आ रहा है, and then what is the next logical step is to really see कि ये suffering क्यों हो रही है.
No one can easily be aware that my ego has arisen. That's it.
But the ego has arisen or the anger has arisen doesn't
There is
really.
a wrong perception. This is the perception of error, rather perception error.
But it doesn't really change in the sense that power.
No, you see the ego is such a tenacious thing. It is a part of human genetic code. So it takes quite some time for it to realize. Quite some time. It is a recalcitrant habit. Bar.
Yeah, but my question was that do we need to, whenever possible,
You just be aware of it.
or
No,
take
you
it
can't
to
do
the
anything.
take it to the
No,
step.
if you try to feel bad about it, then again there will be a problem.
Not quite. If we try to take it to the step and try to reason out that why I'm feeling suffering.
That will be obvious immediately. It becomes immediately obvious that is, the person honked and I am taking it personally. And he may be suffering because of some other reason and honking because he is in a trouble. And I am taking it personally. Most of the time it is the reason. We misunderstand others. We don't know what others' motives are. Then we interpret उसका motive ये था ऐसा करने में या ऐसा करने में.
So एक मेरा थोड़ा slightly moving away from the topic, एक question है कि so many times at least I've seen is that I get stressed because either I'm running late or कुछ करना है ऑफिस के लिए देर हो गई है. Again, situation is not favorable and the most common way to react is with stress or hasten up things. I've seen the opposite way also, that sometimes one is feeling very lazy, कुछ करने का मन नहीं कर रहा, आराम से सिगरेट पे सारे घर में काम पेंडिंग है कर रहे हैं. So in both the situations, what I've seen is that at least in case of stress, so what stress actually does is that it brings you sense of hastiness. ये भी करो वो भी करो, जल्दी से गाड़ी स्टार्ट करो, भागो, कितनी तेज छोटे डिस्टेंस पे भी जितनी तेज चला फिर एकदम तेज ब्रेक मारेगा. And it again boils down to more stress. And till the time you are actually not out of that situation where it again naturally dies. What I've seen is that if we try to slow things down, it becomes a natural way to come out of the stress. And second aspect, this is the one aspect of stress. Second aspect is laziness. Even then also in laziness also you say कि let me do things slowly, but be more mindful of what I'm doing, mindful of whether I'm walking, and mindful of what I'm doing in the kitchen, and mindful of arranging the house, and it actually takes you out of laziness also, brings some sort of alertness also. And so my question was really is that what is there anything in this that doing things slowly and being more mindful brings your alertness? Or
See, if one is more mindful, obviously it will lead to good. Definitely lead to good. But does not mean that a mindful person cannot run.
mindful person
Cannot run, that he has to walk slowly all the time. So it's always possible.
Point of view is that slowing down and being mindful may not be the case.
So actually, the only meaning I have in slowing down is that doing it a reasonably easy way. आराम से कहीं घर में काम कर रहे हो, आराम से उठाते रह रहे हो, ऐसा नहीं कि धीरे 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 करने, मतलब there is no artificial way, but more relaxed and natural way. That's the thing I will observe.
Doing things in a relaxed, mindful way is always better. But that should not become lead to laziness. वो बड़ा हो जाता ना. It has a tendency to slip into that direction. So just as doing things fast has a tendency to slip into laziness, kind of a frenzy, excited all the time, hyperactive all the time, that kind of thing. So there are always these checks which we have to apply.
Definitely, I think.
Checks.
मतलब mental alertness to see what is arising is possibly the good check to see क्या होगा. There is one more question I wanted to ask. So many times when one is, at least I am one alert, and you can actually, आप जो कर रहे हो उसको ध्यान से कर रहे हो, you are having sensations क्या कुछ पकड़ा हुआ है. So there is this brief flashes which happen when you are lost in thought, and then you again come back. I said my thought with I come back. So so this my question was that when one is thinking, does one lose mindfulness to some extent?
Unless you have made a resolve that now I will think.
Okay. Yeah.
After जब ध्यान करते हैं तभी तो मन भटक जाता है. So that's why I personally feel that if you meditate both while walking and sitting, then it becomes a seamless activity. Otherwise ये होता है कि हमने 1 घंटा ध्यान किया और ध्यान से उठे तो सब भूल गए. Everything mindfulness is gone. So if we practice that way, in some traditions they practice even in a retreat, 1 hour sitting, 1 hour walking, 1 hour sitting, 1 hour walking. Then the seamlessness of the mindfulness begins. तो डेली लाइफ में भी अगर हम माइंडफुली काम कर रहे हैं और मन भटक जाता है It is as good or bad, whatever you may call it, as sitting in a meditation and mindfulness. It's okay.
We talked about Dhan as the beginning, as the different stages. So I find that Dhan has two sides. One is if you जो आप दान करते हैं वो आपकी ईगो को बढ़ा सकता है, स्पेशली जब आप इस पोजीशन से दान करते हैं कि भाई मैं दान कर रहा हूँ एंड व्हाट यू गिव डजंट रियली हर्ट यू, डजंट क्रिएट एनी चैलेंज फॉर यू वेयर एंड दैट इज व्हाई आई थिंक दे यूज्ड टू से दैट दान वो करना चाहिए जो आपको प्रिय हो, जो आपको अच्छा लगता है, जिसका डिस्पोजिशन विल क्रिएट अ चैलेंज. So that will, then you will question the self in that sense, and you will probably move in the direction. Otherwise, it actually emboldens